Seems like Doctor Who and the Daleks or something. Lavinia's not here. Normal services will be resumed shortly. Lavinia's come down with bronchitis and she's been coughing badly for the last few days, so that's why she's not here this morning. Also, I had a text from Varney Igo, and he's back in Queensland, and he's preached at Townsville and at Charters Towers, as well as being back there with the work in Cairns as well. And he says to say hello to you all. Here's an event that actually happened. The preacher in this story told it to me. There's an elderly man, a faithful Christian, is lying in a hospital bed. The indications are that he does not have long to live. The preacher from his congregation has come to visit him, and they talk for a while, and then the preacher says a prayer for the man. And the preacher asks God that if God would, if it's God's will, that he would strengthen the man, enabling him to be up and about once more. But the old man interrupted the prayer. He said that he had lived a long life during which he had done his best to faithfully serve God. But now he was old. His wife had passed away some years earlier. He was tired. He was ready to go to be with the Lord. Therefore, he said that he didn't want the preacher to pray for his strength to be restored and for his life to be extended. This man, this Christian man, was saying that he had lived a long and full life and that it was time to go. Therefore, it was not necessary or even appropriate for the preacher to pray that his life be extended even further. And that's what I want to talk about today, the idea of appropriate prayer. Because when we go through the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament, there are repeated examples of prayers that were not appropriate, prayers that were inappropriate. For instance, we can go back to John chapter 12 and verse 27. And here Jesus is speaking. He says, "Now my soul has become troubled, and what am I to say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I came to this hour." Jesus had come into the earth to die a sacrificial death for the forgiveness of sins. And it therefore would not be appropriate for him to pray to the Father saying, "Take me from this hour." This hour is why he was there. So that would have been an inappropriate prayer. We can go over to the passage that was just read to us in John 17. And here in verse 15, Jesus is praying for the apostles. And he says to the Father, "I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them away from the evil one." Why had Jesus trained the apostles? Well, it was going to be their job to go out into all the world and preach the gospel. Acts chapter 1 verse 8, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then out on into the rest of the world." So Jesus says it's not appropriate for me to pray for you, the Father, to take them out of the world, but what would be appropriate would be for me to pray that you would keep them from the evil one, because Satan is on the prowl. Satan is opposed to God and to God's people, and was opposed to the establishment of Christianity. So that was something to pray about. We can go even further. We can go over to James the 4th chapter. And here James is speaking to people who really have a very selfish view of things, and they're squabbling with one another. James chapter 4, and actually I'll read from verse 2. You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. And you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, so that you may spend what you request on your pleasures. They were praying inappropriate prayers. They were asking for things simply for the sake of their own pleasure. And such requests were not going to be asked. They were not right. They were not appropriate. We can go over to 1 Peter 5:14, and I'm not going to keep doing this. I'm just trying to give you a sample here. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 14. This is the confidence which we have before him, before God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. If we ask anything according to his will. If we're praying for things that are not in accordance with God's will, then we're praying inappropriate prayers. And an example of an appropriate prayer in that case would be Jesus' prayer in the garden before his arrest and crucifixion, over in Matthew 26 verses 38 and 42, where Jesus says, Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me. If there's any other way of doing this. But then he said, yet not my will, but thine be done. And so he prayed appropriately. He took into consideration the will of the Father. Then just a little bit further down in 1 John chapter 5, this time verses 16 and 17. If anyone sees his brother committing a sin not to death, he shall ask, and God will for him give life to those who commit sin not to death. There is sin to death. I am not saying that he should ask about that. All unrighteousness is sin, and there is a sin not to death. Some of you will have something like not leading to death. You can pray for God to forgive others, unless, of course, they are guilty of sins which result in death. It would not be appropriate to pray for forgiveness of those sins. And you say, well, what might be a sin leading to death? You can say it's where people are persisting in sins and not repentant of those sins. You've got an example over in Hebrews, the 10th chapter, down in verse 26, Hebrews 10:26. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. So the idea there is if you're a Christian and that doesn't make any difference to your life, you're just going to continue sinning, then somebody else can't pray for God to forgive you, because you yourself need to repent. So it would be inappropriate to pray forgiveness in that case. In fact, there's an interesting passage on this over in Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah chapter 7 verses 16 through to 18. Jeremiah lived through the time of Judah's fall to the Babylonians. And God says this to Jeremiah in chapter 7 verse 16. As for you, do not pray for this people, and do not lift up a cry or prayer for them, and do not plead with me, for I am not listening to you. Do you not see what they are doing in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers kindle the fire, the women knead dough to make sacrificial cakes for the Queen of Heaven, and they pour out drink offerings to other gods in order to provoke me to anger. God had sent prophet after prophet warning the people. Jeremiah was trying to warn the people, but the people didn't listen and they were worshipping other gods. And so God says to Jeremiah, do not pray for these people. They are willfully rejecting me. It would be inappropriate for you to pray for them. Just one more example, if you go over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10. We could also say that it would be inappropriate for us to pray for God to do for us what we are not willing to do for ourselves. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10. For even when we were with you, we used to give you this in order: if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. There were those who were not working, who were expected to be subsidized by the church. They expected Jesus to return at any moment. Paul said, no, that's not right. You go on working in order to earn an income to feed yourself and, of course, to feed your family as well. If you're not willing to work, then don't pray for God to give you food. And you could extend that principle. It's inappropriate to pray for God to give you good results in an exam if you're not willing to study. It's inappropriate to ask God to find us a job if we're not willing to get up and get out and look for a job. It's inappropriate for us to pray for God to make us healthy if we're living an unhealthy lifestyle. It's inappropriate for us to pray for God to help us to grow spiritually if we ourselves are doing nothing about our spiritual development. So my point in this summary is that prayer requires thought rather than praying thoughtless cliches year after year. We really need to think about what it is appropriate to pray for. And sometimes, and this happens when we're young in the faith. We pray simple prayers. Please look after the sick. Please grant us safe travelling. Please be with those who are not with us today. Okay, you've got to start somewhere. But if we go on with that being our level of prayer, then something's not right. And I want to particularly think about that today in regard to prayers for healing, prayers dealing with the health of others. In regard to illness or injury, no matter how bad might be the illness or the injury, we often hear prayers that go something like this: Lord, please help Mary or George or whoever it might be to get well again so that they can be back with us. And again, that's a starting point. But let me describe a couple of situations. I'm not giving the exact medical facts here, but these are situations that I have known. In the first case, a man suffers a severe brain hemorrhage and is in a coma. Christians pray that he might get better again. However, somebody with medical experience, medical training, talks to me and says the extent of the brain bleed is such that even if that person does recover, it's likely that they will have suffered some sort of brain injury, and this will have extensive effect on their lifestyle. They are going to need 24-hour care. But not understanding the medical implications, people pray for him to get better in the same way that you might pray for a person to recover from a cold. They simply think it's a matter of him waking up again. And that's, if he wakes up from the coma, then everything will be okay. Well, not quite that straightforward. In another case, a Christian has something like muscular dystrophy, a condition which causes a wasting of muscles and increasing disability. And over the years, that person's condition has gone from the point where they've had to use a walking stick to the point where they've been in a wheelchair, to the point where eventually they spend their time either in a bed or a special medically designed chair in a nursing home. Now, again, it's prayed that that person might get better again and be back at church. And in fact, that prayer is prayed many times down through the months and even down through the years, as though that person simply had a cold and could improve. But that wasn't the way it was. And over the years, I've known many people with severe injuries and health problems, some of which are described as degenerative or incurable. In some cases, they're given only a short time to live, and yet brief, simple prayers are prayed asking, Lord, please help them to get better. But, once more, the problem is that the prayers don't really reflect a grasp of what somebody is going through. And we have to ask the question, are such prayers appropriate given the circumstances? Now, I recognise that those who are praying such prayers in some cases may be young in the faith, they may be inexperienced, they may not be familiar with the medical situation, they may not realise the seriousness of the illness or the injury. But what I'm getting at today is this question: is it good if we go on praying the same simplistic prayers year after year, regardless of a person's condition? Either our prayers stay at the same simple level year after year, or even as a person their condition degenerates year after year, we still pray, Lord, please make them better so that they can be back with us. Is it good if the limited nature of our prayers never mature and just stay at the same simple, childlike level? In other words, Lord, please help so-and-so to get better so that they can be back with us. Again, I recognise that a person may be praying that sincerely and just saying what they know to say. But I'm also here getting at the idea of growth. Now that raises another question. Well, if a person is really seriously ill or injured, does that mean that we shouldn't pray for their healing? I'm going to say that depends. For instance, let's suppose that a person is well into their 90s. They have been restricted to bed for some time. They've reached the point where they tend to spend most of their time sleeping. They're not really interested in food or drink. Now, the indication in that case is that life is taking its natural course. The time that person has reached the time where their life on earth is naturally drawing to a close. Praying for them to recover and to be back at church again would not appear to be an appropriate prayer. Physical death is a natural part of physical life. And so we can't pray for God to go on postponing it. Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 1, there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every matter under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die. And eventually that time comes for each one of us. In fact, as I was thinking about that section, in the back of my mind I could remember one of the health bulletins that was given regarding King George V as he lay dying. He had been sick for some time. He had chronic lung diseases and was in fading health. And on the evening of January the 20th, 1936, this announcement was made: the King's life is moving peacefully towards its close. And there are times when that is the situation and a person is of such age that that's to be understood and expected. Incidentally, there's a bit more to that story if you do read of it, but nevertheless, that was the situation. He was declining towards the end, if you like. But whereas in a case like that, yeah, we can understand that the person is facing death. That's natural, that's to be expected. But in other cases, we don't have the medical certainty to be able to say, oh, well, they're going to die, no point in praying otherwise, because it's not that simple. And even doctors and surgeons will tell you it's not that simple. For instance, there's a very good book on practical aspects of human suffering. It's called Let This Cup Pass. It's by Jane McWhorter, a member of the church. I believe, from memory, we have a copy there in the library. Jane McWhorter was critically injured when a car travelling too fast on the wrong side of the road slammed head-on into her car. And this is her husband's description of her injuries. The head injury alone resulted in the fracturing of her skull in more than 200 places. Her arm, ribs, back, pelvis and leg were broken. We kept vigil in the waiting room of the intensive care unit of Erlanger Hospital for more than a month as her life hung in the balance. So you're aware of those injuries. You perhaps have seen her. The weeks are going by and you're praying, and yet there's no indication that she's going to come through. You might think, well, there's no point. The injuries are too bad, and yet Jane McWhorter revived. She healed. She walked away from the hospital, and she wrote various books. I've told you before of a man that I knew in Tasmania. I went to visit him in the ICU unit at the hospital. This was back in the 1980s when I was working there. And he was unconscious, and I asked the doctor about his survival, and the doctor's words were, barring a miracle, he's not going to pull through. Now, he wasn't literally calling for a miracle, but he was saying, look, all the indications are that this man will not survive. Well, that man did survive and recovered and walked away from the hospital and continued with his life. A lady I dealt with again in Launceston, Tasmania, manic depressive with schizoid tendencies. That's the medical description of her condition. She would take too many pills at times. She would just be right away with the fairies, we would say, mentally. And I dealt with her for some years. And she'd had a lobotomy while those sorts of surgeries were carried out, and you'd say she hasn't got much chance. Her name was Gwen, and she went on living and living and living. And in fact, I knew a lady in the church in Perth when I was working over there, and the doctor called her in one time and said, look, your condition's not great. This lady had lost the use of one lung and part of the use of the other lung. But she had money, and the doctor said, well, look, get out, travel, do some things to enjoy yourself, because I'm sorry to say you're not going to live a long life. Time passed, that doctor died. She got another doctor. Time passed, that doctor died. She got another doctor. She lived into her 90s. So, we cannot make a judgment and say, oh, well, I'm certain that this person is not going to recover. We just don't know that at times. And so even when a person's condition is said to be terminal, I don't give up on prayer, because I've seen situations where, as I say, people recover and do go on living their lives. Now, if they're of an age where they could still do something with their life, I pray that if it's God's will, that God might heal them and use them for His purposes. But if I know that it's a serious situation and the person's situation is not certain as far as living or dying, then I try to keep all of that in my prayer. And I think of, okay, if that person does recover, what might be their situation? What might be their needs in the future? And what about the family and so forth? And so I pray for all the aspects that are involved there. In fact, Paul makes a statement that's relevant here over in Philippians chapter 1, beginning in verse 21. He's talking about his own condition. He's there in custody in Rome, awaiting the outcome of a trial, and he's been in custody by this time for something like 4 years. His belief, his idea is that in all likelihood he's going to be released, found not guilty, but that's not absolutely sure. And so look at what he says, Philippians 1 verse 21. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labour for me. And I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better. Yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sakes. Convinced of this, I know I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. But even as he writes on, there's still that question mark of what exactly is going to be the outcome. So as he thinks about this, he thinks about both possibilities, and that's what I'm saying in regard to prayer. That if a person is in a serious condition, then pray to God, uncover the various possibilities that might lie ahead. And while I'm talking about this, let me make this point, and we'll go over to Matthew 25 and verse 36 in regard to this. We should not let prayer be a substitute for action. That would not be appropriate. In some cases, we may go on praying for somebody for months. We may even pray for them for years if they have a slowly degenerating condition. And yet, we never go visit them. We never go to see if there is family, might need help. And Jesus touches on this in Matthew 25, beginning in verse 31 through to the end of the chapter, where you've got the parable of the Last Judgment, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where he divides people into two groups. Those on the right, those on the left. Those on the right have done good. And amongst Jesus' comments in this parable, in verse 36, he says to these people, I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Notice that? I was sick and you visited me. And these people are blessed because of that. By all means, we need to pray for the sick. But there's also the idea of doing what we can to help in other ways. And that includes visiting. Even if you can't make them better, it makes a person sometimes feel good to know that people care about them. And have somebody come and spend some time with them. So, what would be appropriate when praying for the sick and injured? Number one, talk to the family or even to the person themselves to find out the details of their situation. Now, they might not want to tell you everything, and don't pry, but try to understand what their condition is. Is it of a nature that you can simply pray, Lord, help them to get better and be back with us, as though they're just suffering from a cold? Or is there more to it than that? Even if they're able to get out of bed, are they going to face consequences of their sickness or their injury? And what about the family or the wife or the husband? Are there going to be issues for them in supporting this person? Try to get a grasp of the situation. And then think about it. Think about what its impact is, what its consequences are, what the effects might be, both short term and maybe there's going to be long term as well. And so pray then with the full picture in mind, rather than just a simplistic, Lord, please help Mary to get better so she can be back with us again. There might be more to it than that. A third point, remember to pray that God's will be done. And when you say that, mean it. And again, I go back to Jesus praying in the garden, Matthew 26, verses 39 and 42, where Jesus said, not my will, but yours be done. And so what might be God's purpose in this? Think of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where God gave him a thorn in the flesh, and Paul prayed for it to be removed, and the message was, no, it's going to stay because you need it. You need it to remind yourself to depend upon me. And so there may be a purpose in the illness. And I know of situations where people who were sick actually used their illness for God. One person who was a member here led several people to cry. I baptized several people through what that lady did during the time of her illness to talk to those who cared for her. So keep in mind God's purpose. And look, if you're struggling to know exactly what to pray for and what the outcome might be and so forth, then put that in your prayer. Put it all there for God. I mean, God knows the full picture. Come over to Romans chapter 8, verses 26 and 27. This is something to keep in mind. And I do at times. I've got a range of people in my mind here in Australia and overseas, Christians, who are going through some quite significant problems, and sometimes you wrestle with, well, what exactly do I pray in this case? Look, Romans 8 verses 26 and 27. Now in the same way the Spirit also helps our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we should, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who searches the hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because he intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. This is not saying that the Spirit puts the words of the prayer in your mind, but it is saying that the Spirit helps in the communication process, so that even if you are wrestling with exactly what to say and how to say it, God is still going to understand. And hopefully over time, as you gain more experience, and you will gain a better ability to pray for various circumstances. And let me add too, don't pray just because you've got to, just because it seems the right thing to do. Pray with faith. Believe. If you're asking God for healing according to his will, then believe that if it is his will, God can heal, no matter what the seriousness of the condition might be. James chapter 1 and verse 6, but he must ask in faith without any doubting, For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that person ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Don't pray with the well, I don't know if this will work or not. I don't know whether God is going to answer this or not. No. If you pray, then pray with belief. What about the power of God to heal? Well, Ephesians 3 verse 20, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think. Now that's applying in one situation, but that's the principle there, that God has power. And I've seen people who were supposed to be dying actually recover from that. So don't limit God. Have faith in his ability. You go through the Bible, you find some very detailed prayers. 1 Kings chapter 8, a prayer of Solomon's. John 17, a lengthy prayer of Jesus. Ephesians 1, Colossians 1, detailed prayers of Paul. A significant aspect of these prayers is their detail and their relevance. They don't consist just of short cliches, but rather those prayers apply very much to the situation under consideration and go into detail about the situation. And so that's something that we should aim to grow to, where we can pray for things thoroughly, you might say. Let me mention somebody here in the congregation, Diane. We've been praying for some time for Diane. And it's easy to say, Lord, please help Diane to get better so that she can be back with us here again. The fact is that Diane has a degenerative condition which gets worse over time. Now God could intervene, but the indication is that she is degenerating. Her condition is getting worse over time. Well, what do I pray for? Well, do you understand the condition that she has? If not, talk to Warren. Find out. I keep a medical dictionary at home because when church members ring me up and say, I've got such and such, I can quickly grab my dictionary while they're talking and think, what have they got? And just check on that. But find out about the situation. By that means, then you've got some understanding and you can say prayers, you can pray prayers which are specific, which are relevant, which are appropriate. You can also learn how the condition affects Warren and the family. And so you can do more to, say, encourage him and help him in the situation and understand what may lie ahead here. And this doesn't just apply in the case of Warren and Diane. It applies in many other cases. As I say, I've got a list of people here in the church, in Sydney and other places, who are struggling with some serious conditions. I'm reminded that in Luke 11 and verse 1, Jesus was asked, teach us how to pray. It's something that we can grow in. It's something we can learn more about. Let's make it an aim to do that. To learn to pray to God and just wrestle with all the aspects of whatever we're praying for, with the understanding that God hears and that God helps according to his will. Prayer is powerful. We are assured of that in the Word. Let's not limit its power. I'll hand over to Warren. I've just had a mental blank for a moment.